The valley still belonged to winter, though the calendar had turned and men in towns far away might already be speaking of spring. In the Shenandoah, cold did not leave in a single gesture. It lingered in the hollows, held fast to the shaded ground, settled into timber and bone alike, and made every small task feel longer than it ought to be. Ranchel's cabin stood at the edge of a clearing carved from the forest by axe, fire, and stubborn need. The land there did not look conquered so much as interrupted. Stumps rose like broken teeth from the earth. Charred trunks lay where they had fallen months before, half buried now under a crust of old snow glazed hard by thaw and night frost. Beyond the narrow field, the trees pressed close again, oak, hickory, pine, climbing the slopes toward blue ridges that seemed, at times, less like land than like weather made solid. The cabin itself was small, square-shouldered, built of green logs not yet settled into place. Sap still scented the wood when the sun struck the walls. Clay chinking had dried and cracked in thin veins, letting the wind whisper through on long nights. The roof of split boards sagged slightly to the west, where one of the ridge poles had warped. Smoke from the chimney rarely rose straight, it bent low, dragged sideways by the valley winds. It was not the house she had been promised. Ranchel did not dwell on that thought often, but it came to her in unguarded moments, when she stood at the door at first light, when she lay awake listening to the logs shift in the cold, when she scrubbed mud from the floor that never truly came clean. Promises, she had learned, were a kind of weather too. They moved in quickly, filled the sky, and then were gone, leaving the air sharper than before. Inside, the cabin held one room and a loft space where dried corn still hung in a thinning braid. The hearth dominated the far wall, its stones uneven, laid by hands that had known more hurry than craft. A rough table stood near the single window, its oiled hide shutter pulled closed against the wind. 3 small pallets lay close together near the warmest stretch of floor, patched quilts pulled tight around narrow bodies. Robert woke first each day. He was 6, though in the past 2 months something in his face had settled into a seriousness that belonged to older boys. He rose without complaint, pulling on stockings still stiff from yesterday's damp, and went about the quiet duties he had learned by watching. He checked the embers, coaxed them with breath before adding kindling the way his father had shown him, careful not to wake the little ones. Jean, 4 years old and quick in both temper and laughter, slept curled around her rag doll, thumb tucked under her cheek. Her hair, the same dark brown as Ranchel's, fell in a tangle she fought each morning like a small, indignant battle. Patrick, barely 1, stirred and sighed in the wooden cradle box set near the hearth, his breath soft and damp against the wool wrapped around him. Ranchel rose last only because she slept lightest. She had not known, before this place, how many kinds of silence existed. There was the deep night quiet of the valley when the wind dropped and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. There was the brittle silence before snowfall. There was the hollow quiet that followed her husband's last breath, a space so sudden and complete it had felt, for a moment, like deafness. He had been ill 5 days. The cough came first, sharp and tearing, then the fever that burned through him until his skin felt strange to the touch, as though it no longer belonged entirely to the world of the living. She had sat where she sat now, by the hearth, cloth in hand, counting the rise and fall of his chest as if numbers might anchor him. The children had watched from their pallets, wide-eyed and obedient in their fear. He had come to these colonies full of plans. Land of his own. Crops enough to sell. A house with glass in the windows one day. He had spoken of it often during the crossing, pointing at nothing but horizon, as though he could already see fields laid out in neat order. Ranchel had not shared that vision. She had boarded the ship because there had been no decent way to refuse. Her father's face had been tired that winter, her mother's hands red and cracked from work that never eased. A husband with land, even if the land lay across an ocean, had seemed to them like rescue. She had not known how to explain that rescue, too, could feel like loss. The ocean had taken her sickness, her appetite, and whatever certainty she had once possessed. The land had taken the rest. Now it asked still more. After her husband's burial, a narrow grave cut into frozen ground by two neighbors who had not stayed long, the weight of the place shifted. Tasks that had once been shared became solitary. The cows still needed watering. Wood still needed splitting. Fences leaned and did not right themselves. The small field, turned once the previous spring, lay rough and stubborn under winter's hold, waiting for hands that felt too few. Some mornings, standing at the threshold with the cold biting through her thin shoes, she felt the land watching. Not with malice, not with kindness. Only with the blank patience of something that had endured long before her and would endure after. "You will not best it by staring," she would mutter to herself, and step out. That morning the sky was a pale, brittle blue, the kind that promised nothing warmer. Frost feathered the edges of the window hide. When she opened the door, the air cut her lungs sharp as green apple. Her breath clouded white before her face. Robert followed with the bucket, silent as always now, though once he had been quick with questions. She handed him the rope at the well and steadied the handle as he leaned his small weight back to draw the water up. His arms shook, but he did not complain. "You must not grow old before me," she said quietly. He glanced at her, uncertain whether it was a jest. She managed a thin smile, and he returned one, brief and careful. Inside again, she fed the fire, set oats to boil, shifted Patrick from one hip to the other while stirring with her free hand. Jean woke and began to talk at once, words tumbling over each other about a dream she had half forgotten. The sound filled the room, thin but bright, and for a moment the cabin felt less like a place held together by will alone. By midday, clouds had begun to gather along the western ridge. The light dimmed, turned the snow outside a dull gray. Ranchel was seated at the table, mending the elbow of Robert's shirt, when the dog gave a short, uncertain bark. She froze. The dog did not bark at wind. Nor at deer. This sound held surprise, not warning. Robert looked up from the hearth, poker in hand as if it had become an extension of him. Jean went quiet, sensing the shift in the air more quickly than she understood it. Ranchel set the shirt aside. Her heart had begun to beat in a heavy, deliberate way she recognized from the weeks after her husband's death, when every unfamiliar sound at night seemed to carry threat. "Stay here," she said softly. She crossed the cabin and lifted the latch, opening the door only enough to see. Figures moved beyond the fence line, dark against the pale ground. Men. 4 of them, wrapped in furs and rough coats, rifles slung across their backs. Horses stood behind, heads low, steam rising from their flanks. Trappers, she thought. Or hunters far from any settlement. The tallest man raised a gloved hand, palm out in a gesture of peace. Even at a distance she could see the weariness in their posture, the slow way they shifted their weight, as if the road had pressed itself into their bones. The wind carried the faint smell of leather, wood smoke, and unwashed wool. Ranchel kept her hand firm on the door. Behind her, the cabin felt very small. The wind rose quickly after she saw them, as if their arrival had carried the weather with it. The clouds that had gathered along the ridge thickened and lowered, swallowing what little light remained in the afternoon. The valley darkened in the space of minutes, the air turning heavy with the promise of snow. The tall man stepped closer to the fence but did not cross it. "Ma'am," he called, voice rough with cold and road dust. "We seek only shelter for the storm. Your barn would serve. Will not trouble your house." Ranchel studied them one by one. Their coats were stiff with travel, for at the collars worn thin. Their horses stood with heads hanging, sides heaving lightly. These were not men riding for mischief, they were men trying to outlast the season. Still, hunger and exhaustion could turn men unpredictable. "You'll keep to the barn," she said. No fire near the hay. No coming to the door once dark. Relief loosened their faces. You have my word, the tall one said. They moved slowly, unsaddling with care that spoke of tired muscles. One of them lagged behind, fumbling at the buckle of his cinch. He swayed, bracing himself against the horse's flank. Is he drunk? Ranchel asked sharply. The man nearest him shook his head. Fever took him 2 days past. He's been riding through it. As if hearing his condition named, the sick man lifted his head. His face was pale beneath windburn and beard, eyes unfocused, mouth parted as though breath came harder than it should. Something in Ranchel tightened, a memory too recent to ignore. The heat in the skin. The way strength seemed to drain out through the eyes first. If he stays in the barn tonight, he'll freeze, she said. The men hesitated. One glanced toward the darkening sky. We've blankets, he offered, though without conviction. The wind drove a handful of dry snow across the clearing, whispering over the crust. Ranchel felt the children's presence behind her like a second heartbeat. Risk had weight now, it had names. I have little space, she said. And 3 small ones. The tall man met her gaze steadily. Will not bring harm to your family. Harm did not always ask permission, she thought. But neither did mercy. Bring him, she said at last. Only him. The rest of you keep to the barn. They carried him between them, boots scraping on the frozen ground. Up close she could see how his body had folded in on itself, as if the effort of holding upright had become too much. When they laid him on a pallet near the hearth, heat rolled off him in a wave that made her flinch. What's his name? She asked. David, one said. Good man. Hard traveler. David's eyes opened briefly, gray and glassy. They found her face, lingered there with the unfocused intensity of the fevered. Much obliged, he murmured, the words slurring at the edges. The other men backed toward the door, uneasy in the close warmth, uncertain on the ground of a woman's household. We ride at first light, the tall one said. If he can sit a horse, he comes. If not. He did not finish. He did not need to. The door shut behind them. The storm arrived in earnest. Snow struck the walls in dry, restless bursts. The wind pressed at the roof boards, found every weakness in the chinking. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight and breath and the close smell of damp wool. Ranchel knelt beside the stranger. His skin burned under her hand. She fetched water, stirred in crushed willow bark, lifted his head and held the cup to his lips. He swallowed with difficulty, coughing halfway through, the sound deep and tearing. Robert watched from his pallet, eyes wide but silent. Jean clutched her doll tight against her chest. Patrick fussed, then slept again. You'll drink, Ranchel said firmly. Whether you wish it or no. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. I've known worse commands. Through the night she rose again and again. To tend the fire. To check the children. To wipe the sweat from David's face as the fever climbed and would not break. Once, near dawn, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength, eyes open but seeing something else. River's too high, he muttered. We'll lose the pack. You're safe, she said, though she was not certain what that word meant anymore. Morning came gray and hard. The other trappers returned, stamping snow from their boots. They stood over their companion, reading the truth in his face. He'll not ride, one said quietly. David's gaze cleared just enough to fix on them. He gave a small shake of his head. Go on, he rasped. Season won't wait. They lingered, torn between loyalty and the road's demands. In the end, the road won. They left a small pouch on the table, powder, perhaps, or coin, clasped his shoulder one by one, and went. The door closed. Their hoofbeats faded. Ranchel stood still a long moment, listening to the emptiness that followed. "You should have gone," she said, not turning. David's answer was a whisper dragged over stone. "Likely." The days narrowed to the space between hearth and pallet. Outside, the storm passed, but the cold held. Inside, time was measured in breaths and sips of broth. She fed him when he could swallow, cooled his skin with damp cloths, listened to the rattle in his chest with a dread she knew too well. Sometimes he drifted into talk, fragments of places she could not picture, wide rivers, trading posts, forests so deep the light never touched the ground. She listened without meaning to, his voice threading through the small sounds of her household until it seemed almost natural that he should be there. In quieter moments, when the children slept and the fire burned low, she found herself speaking too. "I did not want this place," she said once, more to the dark than to him. "I came because there was no decent way to refuse." And she stopped, the old anger rising, sharp and useless. He thought wanting was enough to make it good. David's eyes were half open, fever bright but attentive. "The land's hard on dreams," he murmured. "Yes," she said. "It is." When the fever broke, it did so without ceremony. One morning his skin was merely warm, not blazing. His breathing eased. He slept long, deeply, as though his body had stepped back from a cliff edge. 2 days later he pushed himself upright, swaying with the effort. "You've done me a great kindness," he said. Ranchel shrugged, suddenly shy of gratitude. "You were in need." "I still am," he said, glancing toward the door, where the field lay under its thinning cover of snow. She followed his gaze. The ground would soften soon. Work waited, indifferent to grief or exhaustion. "Who helps you turn it?" he asked. She did not answer. Silence settled, heavy with what both could see. At last he drew a slow breath. "I owe you my life," he said simply. "Let me put it to use a while. Until the ground's sown. Until your hold here's sure." Ranchel looked at him then, truly looked, at the hollows still under his cheekbones, at the steadiness returning to his eyes. "You've your own road," she said. He shook his head once, small but certain. "Road's not going anywhere," he replied. "But neither is your land. Not if there's strength to keep it." Outside, water began to drip from the eaves, slow and steady, the first sound of winter loosening its grip. Spring did not arrive with ceremony. It came the way breath returns after illness, in small increments that only the attentive noticed. The morning still bit at exposed skin, and the valley mist still gathered low in the hollows, but the light held longer on the cabin wall. The creek loosened its icy edges and began to speak again, not with the hard crack of thawing plates but with a steady, insistent murmur. The earth took on that particular smell that Ranchel had learned to associate with work that could not be delayed, damp clay, old leaves, and something faintly sweet, like sap pulled upward through living wood. David rose earlier now, not out of restlessness alone, but out of purpose. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet shift of his boots on the floor, the careful lift of the iron pot from its hook, the soft scrape as he moved the poker through the embers. He never made a show of it, never announced what he was doing, as though labor were a kind of language best spoken without emphasis. Ranchel lay still a moment longer than she needed, listening, and found herself measuring the sounds the way she had measured her husband's breathing in his last days. But these sounds did not carry fear. They carried a steadiness that made something inside her unclench, almost against her will. When she finally rose, she found Robert already awake too, wrapped in a blanket by the hearth, watching David coax fire into flame. Robert held a piece of kindling in his hands and looked up when Ranchel entered the room, as if gauging whether she approved of this new dawn arrangement. She did not speak. She only began preparing oats, moving around them as though it were natural that there should be two figures by the hearth, one grown and one small, both intent on keeping the cabin warm. David glanced toward her and nodded once, a greeting without intrusion. "Mornin'," he said softly. "Mornin'," she answered, equally low. Jean woke next, as she always did, with suddenness. She sat up on her pallet, hair in a snarl, and blinked at David as though he had appeared from a dream. "Are you still here?" she demanded, voice thick with sleep. David turned toward her with exaggerated seriousness. "I'm still here." Jean considered him, then nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Because today we plant things, and it will be hard, and you are tall." Ranchel tried not to smile as she poured water into the pot. David replied as solemnly, "A fair assessment." Patrick began fussing in his cradle box, the small sound rising in pitch until it insisted on attention. Ranchel reached for him automatically, but David was closer. He lifted the baby with care, supporting his head, and Patrick quieted as if recognizing the rhythm of David's chest. Ranchel froze for half a heartbeat, then forced her hands back to their work. She would not hover. She would not snatch. She would not betray how much the sight affected her. "You've held babies before," she said, aiming for neutral. David rocked Patrick gently. "Not many. But enough to know they don't like being ignored." Patrick stared up at him, wide-eyed, and then, astonishingly, grinned. His toothless mouth opened in pure delight, as though David's face were the first good thing he had seen all winter. Jean squealed. "He likes you." David blinked, as though caught off guard. "Does he now?" Ranchel set bowls on the table a little too firmly. She could not decide if the warm pressure behind her ribs was relief or something more dangerous. After breakfast, they dressed for work. Layers that still smelled faintly of smoke and winter damp. Hands already roughened, knuckles cracked. The day's tasks waited like a list written in the air: mend the fence where the snow had brought it down, clear stones from the field edge, sharpen the plowshare, begin turning the softened ground. David inspected the plow like a man assessing a tired animal. "It'll do," he said. "But it wants care." "It's had none," Ranchel answered. He looked at her then, a quick glance, as though he understood that she was not speaking only of iron. He took the whetstone, crouched in the weak sun, and began to sharpen the share. The sound was steady, rasping, almost soothing. Robert sat at his side as if drawn by gravity, eyes fixed on the movement. "Why must it be sharp?" Robert asked. David paused, holding the blade at an angle. "Because the earth is stubborn. Sharp iron persuades it without tearing." Robert frowned. "Can the earth feel?" David's mouth twitched. "Not the way you do. But it answers. If you treat it rough, it answers rough back." Ranchel, carrying a basket of seed, stopped and listened. There was nothing sentimental in David's tone. If anything, he sounded practical. Yet the words carried a kind of respect she had not often heard in this place, where men spoke of land as if it were an enemy to defeat. They started the field work once the sun had warmed the ground enough for the blade to bite. David took the plow handles and leaned into them, shoulders set, back working under his shirt as the iron cut the first furrow. Ranchel followed with the seed sack at her hip, scattering in a practiced arc. It was a motion her body remembered more readily than her mind. Step, swing, release. Step, swing, release. The seeds rattled like small promises. The children trailed behind. Robert with his stick, breaking clods. Jean with her apron turned into a basket, gathering stones with exaggerated importance. Patrick sat bundled near the field edge, chewing on a cloth and watching the world with solemn patience. They worked without much talk, and yet the silence between Ranchel and David felt less like absence and more like shared understanding. When he slowed, she slowed. When she paused to adjust the sack, he held the plow steady without comment. The work became a kind of conversation in itself. At midday, David stopped, wiped sweat from his brow, and nodded toward the stump near the fence. "We'll rest," he said. Jean protested immediately. "But we're not finished." David crouched to her level. "Even strong men rest, Jean. Otherwise they fall over and become burdens." Jean's eyes widened. "You would fall over?" "Absolutely," David said with grave sincerity. "Right into the mud." Jean looked horrified, then burst into laughter. The sound startled Ranchel, bright and unguarded. David's eyes flicked toward her as if checking whether she minded that he had made her daughter laugh. Ranchel did not mind. She did not know how to admit how much she did not mind. They ate bread and a scrap of salted meat, shared between them. Robert chewed slowly, eyes on the newly turned earth. "Ma," he said quietly, "it looks better." Ranchel swallowed, throat tight. "It does," she managed. David glanced at her, and in that glance was something like restraint, an understanding not to press her into gratitude that would feel like debt. On the walk back to the cabin, Jean ran ahead, dragging a stick through puddles and declaring herself a wagon. Patrick fussed, and Ranchel reached for him, but David shifted him to her with a gentle motion that was careful not to linger. "Your arms will be tired," he said simply. "I am always tired," she replied before she could soften it. David's expression did not change, but his voice grew quieter. "Then we'll share it where we can." That night, after the children slept, David sat near the hearth with a block of wood and a knife, carving. The fire painted his face with warmth, softening the lines left by travel. Ranchel mended a shirt by lamplight, the needle pulling through fabric with a rhythm that matched the quiet scrape of his blade. Jean, refusing sleep as a principle, crept from her pallet and sat cross-legged near David's feet. "What is it?" she whispered. "A horse," he whispered back. "Robert already has a horse." "This one is smaller," David said. "For Patrick when he's bigger." Jean's eyes widened, reverent. "Will you make me one too?" David pretended to consider. "What would you like?" Jean did not hesitate. "A wolf." "But a good wolf." "A good wolf," David repeated, as if this were a perfectly ordinary request. Ranchel's needle paused. She watched him bend over the wood, attentive to a child's imagination as though it mattered, as though it deserved the same respect as a plow line. Her husband had not been unkind to the children, but he had been preoccupied, always chasing the next task, the next improvement, the next proof to the world that he had been right to come. David seemed to understand that small lives were not interruptions to labor. They were the reason labor mattered. Later, when Jean finally surrendered to sleep, David spoke softly without looking up. "She misses him." Ranchel did not pretend not to understand. "They all do," she replied. "In their ways." David nodded. "And you?" She felt the words land in her chest. She kept sewing, as though the stitch pattern were suddenly of great importance. "I miss what I was promised," she said after a long pause. "Not always him." David's knife slowed. "You can say that," he said quietly. "You don't owe the dead a lie." Ranchel's throat tightened. She had not known how badly she needed someone to say that. The next days brought new routines. David mended the fence where the rails had sagged, setting posts deeper, tamping earth firm with the heel of his boot. Robert followed, carrying nails, proud to be trusted with sharp things. Jean handed them sticks and declared them tools. Patrick crawled on the cabin floor, exploring the world one splinter at a time until Ranchel rescued him with a sigh. David discovered the small weaknesses of the cabin the way a man learns the sore points of his own body. A draft here. A loose board there. He filled cracks with clay, pressed moss into gaps, made the inside quieter. The improvement was subtle, but on the first night the wind rose and the cabin did not sigh so loudly, Ranchel noticed with a kind of gratitude that felt dangerously close to affection. One afternoon, while Ranchel stirred a pot of stew, David came in with mud on his boots and a bundle of something in his arms. "What is that?" she asked, wary. "A rabbit," he said. "Alive?" "Not now." Jean squealed with excitement. Robert leaned forward. Patrick slapped his hands on the floor as if applauding. Ranchel frowned. "We have food." "Not enough," David said simply. "Not if you mean to have any left by the next winter." He did not say it as accusation. He said it as fact. Ranchel turned back to the pot, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. She had lived the past months with the constant pressure of scarcity. The rabbit felt like a small easing of that pressure, like a hand placed under a heavy load. That evening, as she skinned and cleaned it with practiced efficiency, David watched, leaning against the doorframe. "You've done that before," he observed. "In Ireland," she said. "We weren't fine people. We knew hunger." David nodded. "Hunger teaches quickly." There was a pause, and then, unexpectedly, he added, "I'm sorry he took you from where you wished to be." Ranchel's knife stopped. The rabbit lay half-skinned, pale under firelight. "I did not tell you I wished to be anywhere else," she said carefully. David met her gaze, calm. "You didn't have to." Something hot rose behind her eyes, sudden and humiliating. She blinked hard and resumed her work, hands steady by force of will. "You're too perceptive," she muttered. David's mouth curved faintly. "No. Just practiced at listening. It keeps a man alive in the woods." She did not answer, but the words stayed with her into the night. As the weeks passed, the field's green lines thickened. Corn shoots rose sturdier. Beans curled upward, delicate and determined. David walked the rows each morning, crouching to inspect leaves, pressing soil around stems. Ranchel began to see the field as something more than a requirement. It became a living proof that the land had not defeated her. And David's presence became something more than help. It became structure. One day, while Ranchel washed clothes by the stream, Robert slipped on a wet stone and fell hard, scraping his knee. He bit back a cry, pride fighting pain. Ranchel hurried toward him, but David reached him first, having come down with an armful of kindling. Robert's jaw clenched. "It's nothing," he insisted. David crouched, examined the scrape, then looked at the boy with a seriousness that matched his own. "It is something," he said. "But it's not the end of the world." He took Robert's hand, steadying him as he stood. "You don't bleed to prove you're strong," David added. "You bleed because you're human." Robert blinked rapidly. Ranchel saw then that her son's desire to be strong was not only pride. It was fear. A small boy's belief that if he could become a man quickly enough, nothing else would be taken. The next day, a rider emerged from the tree line with the careful posture of a man unaccustomed to yielding space. His boots were too well kept for fieldwork, his coat cut for offices rather than weather, and even from a distance there was something in the way he held himself that suggested the land beneath him was a surface to be measured, not lived upon. Men like him did not come to clear fields or mend fences. They came with papers, with authority granted far from the frontier, charged with determining whether land had been properly settled, and with the power to declare it abandoned if it had not. He reined in near the edge of the clearing, eyes moving slowly over the field, the repaired fence, the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney, as though each detail were being weighed rather than seen. "Well," he said, "you've been busy." David came to stand near Ranchel, close enough that their sleeves brushed. The contact was faint, but it steadied her. The man's gaze flicked between them, assessing. So, he said, this is the husband. Ranchel's heart thudded. Her mouth went dry. David answered evenly, I. The lie slid into place like a board nailed down, not elegant, but necessary. The speculator smiled thinly. Good. A widow's claim is always complicated. He let the word hang, enjoying its weight. But a man in the house tends to make matters simpler. Ranchel wanted to strike him. She held her face still instead. I'll expect the fee by the end of the month, the man said, producing papers. Or the tract will be re-entered. Plenty of interest from men with cash and time. David took the papers without haste, glanced at them, then met the speculator's eyes. We'll see it done, he said. The man mounted and rode off, leaving the air stirred behind him. When he was gone, Ranchel turned toward David, anger and fear twisting together. You said that too easily. David folded the papers and tucked them inside his coat. He needed to hear certainty. And what if certainty is a lie? David's gaze held hers. Then we build it into truth. She stared at him, breathing hard. It would have been easier if he had been careless, if he had been foolish. But he was neither. He was calm, deliberate, as though he could take her panic and hold it without flinching. Do you understand, she said, voice low, what it costs me to let you stand there and say that? David's face softened, just slightly. Yes, he said. I do. And you do it anyway. He replied. Because I'm not letting that man take your home. The word home struck her. She had not used it for this place. Not until now, not even in her mind. Hearing it from him felt like a claim and a comfort all at once. That night the cabin felt smaller, warmer, charged with something neither of them spoke about directly. The children were restless, picking up the tension. Jean asked 3 times if the fancy man would come back. Robert watched David with a new intensity, as though measuring what husband meant in practical terms. Patrick fussed until David carried him around the hearth in slow circles, murmuring low sounds that were not quite words. After the children slept, Ranchel stood at the table, folding cloths with unnecessary precision. David washed his hands at the basin, water darkening with dirt. You didn't ask me, Ranchel said quietly. David looked up. Ask you what? Before you agreed to be my husband. He dried his hands slowly. Would you have wanted me to? Ranchel's pulse hammered. She stared at the cloth in her hands, unable to look at him. I don't know, she admitted. David's voice was gentle. Then I'll ask you now, for what it's worth. She swallowed. What are you asking? He came closer, stopping a careful distance away, as though unwilling to corner her. Do you want me here? He asked simply, beyond the work. Ranchel's breath caught. She had not allowed herself to consider that question in full. Work had been safe. Work was necessity. Work did not demand that she expose her heart. She forced herself to lift her eyes. David stood in the firelight, face worn by travel but open in a way few men had ever dared to be with her. He waited, patient, not pushing. Ranchel felt the weight of her life pressing down, the years of obedience, the voyage, the husband she had resented and then mourned in complicated fragments, the months of solitary fear. She also felt, with frightening clarity, the way her house had changed since David entered it. The way the air seemed less heavy. The way laughter had returned. The way her son's shoulders had unknotted. The way her baby had smiled. Her voice failed. She tried again. I want help, she said, and then, fiercely, as if anger could protect vulnerability, and I want you to stop looking at the tree line like it's calling you. David's mouth curved, not amused but tender. That I can't promise overnight. I didn't ask overnight, she said. Silence held them, a living thing. David stepped a fraction closer. May I touch you? He asked quietly. The question was so careful it undid her more than any boldness could have. Ranchel's throat tightened. She nodded once. David's hand came to her cheek, rough palm warm. He did not grip. He did not claim. He simply held her face as though she were something worth steadying. His thumb brushed the line under her eye, where she had not realized tears had gathered. You carry too much alone, he murmured. Ranchel's eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them again, she found herself leaning into his hand without deciding to. That was the beginning. Not a kiss. Not a declaration. Just a leaning, small and honest, like a seed pushing upward through soil. The next day they worked as before, yet everything felt slightly altered, as though an invisible thread now connected them. Their hands brushed more often. Their glances lingered longer. David seemed to notice her exhaustion sooner, stepping in before she asked. Ranchel found herself watching him when she thought she was not, watching the way he lifted Patrick with practiced care now, the way he spoke to Robert as if the boy's thoughts mattered, the way he listened to Jean's endless chatter with genuine attention. Jean, sensing the shift in adult air the way children do, began to test it. One afternoon she announced loudly, David is the new duh. Ranchel nearly dropped the bucket she was carrying. Robert's head snapped up, eyes wide. David paused, holding a bundle of fence rails. His face remained composed, but his gaze flicked toward Ranchel, checking her reaction with quiet caution. Ranchel's cheeks burned. Jean, she said sharply, you do not say such things. Jean frowned. Why not? He fixes things. That is not, Ranchel searched for words that would not wound. That is not how it works. Jean folded her arms. It is how it works with beans. You plant them and then they are there. David coughed once, a sound suspiciously like laughter. He set the rails down and crouched to Jean's height. Your mother is right, he said gently. People aren't beans. Jean looked unconvinced. David continued, but I am your friend. And I will help your mother. That much is true. Jean considered this, then nodded, as if accepting a compromise. All right, she said. But you must still fix the roof. I will, David promised. Ranchel turned away to hide the softness threatening her mouth. That night, after the children slept, Ranchel sat by the hearth, mending again. David sat across from her, sharpening a small knife. The silence between them felt different now. Less defensive. More aware. Do you ever regret it? David asked suddenly. Ranchel looked up. Regret what? Staying alive, he said simply. After your husband died. Ranchel stared at him, startled by the bluntness. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had never admitted, even to herself, how close she had come to wishing the cold would take her too, simply so the strain would end. David's gaze remained steady, not judging. Ranchel swallowed. I regret, she said slowly, that there are days when I feel nothing but anger. And then I look at them, she nodded toward the sleeping children. And I know I have to keep going. But some days. I don't know where the strength comes from. David's voice was quiet. It comes from them. And it comes from you. And sometimes, he added, almost reluctantly, it comes from the fact that someone else is near enough to share it. Ranchel felt the words sink into her chest, heavy and true. She looked down at her stitching, hands trembling slightly. I don't know what I am allowed to want, she admitted, the confession small and raw. David's knife stopped moving. You're allowed to want peace, he said. You're allowed to want laughter. You're allowed to want a hand beside yours. Ranchel's breath hitched. She pressed the needle through cloth harder than necessary. "And what do you want?" she asked, voice low. David's gaze stayed on her face, unflinching. "I want," he said carefully, "to stop moving. Not because I'm too tired to travel, but because I've found something worth staying for." Ranchel's heart thudded painfully. She forced herself not to look away. David continued, "I didn't know that could be a family. I thought it would be a place. But it's this." He gestured vaguely, as if the word family were too large for his mouth yet. Ranchel's throat tightened. She could not give him an answer equal to that honesty. Not yet. But she could give him something. She rose, crossed the space between them, and set her hand on his shoulder. It was a simple touch, steady, like bracing wood. David's breath left him slowly. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. They stayed like that a long moment, neither moving, as the fire crackled softly and the cabin held its quiet. He drew her into his arms slowly, giving her space to change her mind. She did not. Her forehead rested against him, and for a long moment they simply stood, breathing the same air. When he kissed her, it was not hunger first. It was recognition. A meeting, not a taking. Inside the cabin later, under the low roof and the quiet breathing of children who slept unaware of the shift that had taken place in their small world, they came together not out of desperation but choice. There was no haste, no demand. Only the careful unlearning of old fear, the slow discovery of touch that paused when she did, that listened, that asked without words and waited for answer. For Ranchel, the wonder was not closeness, but safety. The absence of dread. The knowledge that her voice could shape what happened. That she was not enduring, but joining. After, she lay with her head against his shoulder, listening to the night insects beyond the walls. Nothing outside had changed. The land was still hard. The debt still real. Winter would come again. But inside the small cabin, something had shifted that no season could undo. She was no longer alone inside her own life. Summer followed without ceremony, as all real things did. The green in the field deepened. Corn leaves widened. Beans climbed. The air grew heavy in the afternoons, scented with warm earth and growing things. And inside the cabin, closeness became its own quiet rhythm. David no longer moved as a guest. He moved as someone who belonged, though never with carelessness. When he touched her in passing, fingers at her waist, a brush of knuckles as they worked side by side, the contact held familiarity, not urgency. At night, after the children slept, they found each other again and again, sometimes with laughter still lingering, sometimes in tired silence where touch was comfort more than fire. Desire grew not as escape from hardship, but as part of living itself. The children felt the change in ways they could not name. Robert stood taller when he walked beside David. Jean declared the house happier and could not explain why. Patrick crawled between them in the mornings, delighted to find both faces there. One evening, while Ranchel hung washing in the long light of late day, David came behind her, arms slipping around her waist, chin resting lightly on her shoulder. "You're smiling," he murmured. She had not known. "Am I?" She looked across the field, green rose straight and promising. "I had forgotten how," she admitted. He kissed the place where her neck curved into her shoulder, warm and unhurried. "I hadn't," he said. "I just hadn't found where to stop." She turned in his arms, and the kiss that followed tasted of summer, warm, chosen, alive. And in those first weeks of summer, between labor and laughter, between shared burdens and shared nights, love grew the way the crops did, not in sudden miracles, but in steady, undeniable unfolding. Summer stood high and heavy over the valley when the men came back. The air that morning already held heat, though the sun had not yet climbed above the ridge. Ranchel was at the wash line, wringing water from a shirt while Jean attempted to catch grasshoppers with fierce, unfocused dedication. Robert and David were near the fence, setting a new post where spring rains had loosened the earth. The sound reached them first, hooves, more than one, approaching at a steady pace. Ranchel felt the noise before she understood it. Something in her body tightened, an old instinct that had learned too well that arrivals rarely brought ease. David straightened slowly, hand resting on the fence post. He did not need to look toward the road to know who it would be. 3 riders emerged from the trees, dust rising faintly around their horses' legs. The same men who had left one winter morning, shoulders hunched against cold, leaving David fevered on her pallet. Now they rode upright, sun-browned, confident, the season having treated them better than it had any crop. One of them raised a hand. David. The name carried easily across the clearing. Robert turned, startled, eyes moving from the riders to David's face. Ranchel watched that face closely. She saw the change there, not joy exactly, but recognition of a former life stepping into the present. David lifted his hand in return, a gesture smaller, more contained. The men dismounted, laughing, clapping him on the back with the rough affection of those who have shared hardship. Their presence brought with it the smell of long travel, leather, sweat, sun. "You look half tame," one of them said with a grin, glancing toward the cabin, the field, the children. David smiled faintly. "Something like." The tall one, the same who had spoken to Ranchel that winter day, removed his hat and nodded toward her with a measure of respect. "Ma'am." Ranchel inclined her head, polite but distant. She felt suddenly like an outsider in her own yard. "We didn't think to find you planted," another man said to David. "Last we saw, you could not keep still long enough to dry your boots." David's gaze flicked toward Ranchel, then back to the men. "Times change." "Aye," the tall one said. "And so do opportunities." There it was. The shift in tone. "We're headed west," he continued. "Beyond the mountains. Boone's gathering men again. Good pay. Better land. Rich hunting. They say the Kentucky country's like Eden itself." The name meant little to Ranchel, but the word land did not. Nor the way David's shoulders stiffened, not with refusal, but with the weight of decision already turning inside him. Robert edged closer to David's side, as though to anchor him. David said nothing. "You've always had an eye for country," the man pressed. "And we could use someone steady. A season's work, maybe less. Enough coin to set a man right for years." Ranchel's hands grew damp around the wet cloth she still held. She had known, somewhere deep, that the road had not released him entirely. She had seen it in the way he sometimes looked toward the tree line at dusk, as if listening. Still, knowing and hearing were different things. David cleared his throat. "When do you leave?" "In 2 days." 2 days. The word struck like cold water. The men talked on, routes, rivers, game sign, their voices blending into a low hum. Ranchel heard none of it clearly. Her mind had begun its old spiral, the one she thought she had escaped. The calculation of absence. The counting of days alone. The memory of standing in doorways watching a man walk away with promises trailing behind him like smoke. After a time, the men mounted again. "Think on it," the tall one said. "We'll camp by the creek tonight." They rode off, leaving the clearing altered. Silence settled. Jean tugged at Ranchel's skirt. "Who were they?" "Friends of David's," she said, voice distant. Robert did not speak. He watched David, waiting. David stood still a moment longer, then set the fence post upright again, as though the conversation had been no more than passing weather. We'll finish this, he said. They worked in strained quiet. The rhythm they had built over months felt broken, uneven. That night, after the children slept, Ranchel sat at the table, hands folded, staring at nothing. David stood by the hearth, turning a small piece of wood in his fingers. "You're going," she said at last. He did not pretend not to understand. The word landed heavy. For how long? A few months. Enough to earn what we need. For the patent. For winter. She looked up sharply. We had a plan. Together. We still do. You leave, she said, voice tightening, and call that together? He stepped closer, but she did not rise. I have to do this, he said. Why? He hesitated. For the land, he said. For the fee. For yourself, she finished. His silence answered. Ranchel felt the old ache open, sharp and humiliating. You said you were done with roads. I said I wanted to stop moving, he corrected gently. But wanting and being able aren't the same. She stood then, anger rising to cover hurt. You think coin will make this safer? You think if you bring back enough silver the winter won't bite? It will bite less, he said. And what of me, she asked. Of them. David's voice softened. I'll come back. She laughed, short and bitter. He flinched at that, but did not step back. I am not him, he said. No, she agreed. You are not. But you are still a man who leaves. The words hung between them, raw. David reached for her, but she moved away. I won't stop you, she said quietly. I will not beg a man to stay. He nodded once, grief and resolve tangled in his expression. I'll come back, he repeated, but softer now, as if saying it to himself. He left at dawn 2 days later. Robert stood stiff, hands at his sides, trying not to cry. Jean waved bravely until the riders were small against the trees. Patrick, too young to understand, laughed at the horses. Ranchel did not wave. She stood in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself, watching until the road swallowed them. The valley felt larger after that. Too large. The days that followed stretched thin and uncertain. Work did not lessen. If anything, it pressed harder. Weeds did not pause for heartbreak. Fences still leaned. The cows still needed milking. The children still woke hungry. But the ease that had entered the house in early summer drained away, leaving something brittle behind. At night, the bed felt wide and cold. Ranchel lay awake listening for sounds that would not come, the shift of his weight, the low murmur of his voice. The old fears returned like unwelcome guests, that she had been foolish to trust, that love was merely another promise the land would not honor. Robert grew quiet again, his old seriousness returning. Jean asked less often when David would be back, as though protecting herself from disappointment. Patrick cried more at night, restless, sensing absence without understanding it. Ranchel moved through the days as she had in widowhood, efficiently, without indulgence, her heart pulled tight like thread. She did not curse him aloud. But some evenings, standing at the edge of the field as the sun dipped behind the ridge, she felt the weight of the sky pressing down and wondered if she had mistaken warmth for permanence, if she had once again built hope on ground that would not hold. And still, beneath the doubt, beneath the anger, a stubborn, fragile thing remained. The memory of his hands, steady on the plow. The sound of his laughter with her children. The way he had said her name as if it mattered. She held to those things the way she held to the land itself, not because they were certain, but because letting go would mean losing everything at once. Autumn came quietly, almost shy after the long strain of summer. The first sign was not color, but air. A coolness that lingered even after the sun rose. A clarity to the sky that made distances seem sharper, closer and farther all at once. The corn stood high now, leaves edged in dry whispering, ears full and heavy. Beans hung in thick clusters. The field no longer looked fragile. It looked like survival made visible. Ranchel moved through the days with the steady endurance she had learned in widowhood. Work did not wait for longing. She rose before light, coaxed the fire, fed the children, walked the rows to check for rot or pests. Her body knew the motions even when her thoughts drifted. She had stopped counting days since David left. Counting had made time heavier. Instead, she marked progress in the field, tassels browning, husks tightening, the slow turning of leaves. The children had stopped asking when he would return. That hurt more than their questions had. Robert worked beside her without complaint, thin shoulders set with determination that belonged to someone older. Jean still talked, but less, as if sensing that loudness might crack something fragile in the air. Patrick had begun walking in uncertain steps, his balance new and unsteady, his small hand often reaching for a presence that was no longer there. That morning, the sun had just cleared the ridge when she heard it, a single horse, not hurried, but not wandering either. The sound came along the same path she had watched too long the day he left. Her hands froze on the basket of beans. She did not turn at once. She had imagined this sound before, only to find it was nothing. A neighbor passing. A stray. But Robert looked up, sharp as a startled deer. "Ma," he whispered. She turned then. A figure rode into the clearing, dust pale around the horse's legs. Leaner, perhaps. Darker from sun. But known. David. He did not raise a hand this time. He rode straight in, dismounted before the cabin as though the distance between road and home had become unbearable. For a moment, no one moved. Jean broke first, a cry tearing from her as she ran full tilt across the yard. David dropped to one knee and caught her, holding her tight, his face buried briefly in her hair. Robert walked, not ran. But his steps quickened near the end. David reached for him too, pulling the boy close, pressing his forehead briefly to Robert's temple in a gesture almost fierce. Patrick toddled uncertainly from the doorway, confusion giving way to recognition. David scooped him up, laughing through something that sounded like a broken breath. Ranchel stood still. Her heart pounded not with relief, but with something sharper. Guarded. Wounded. David looked at her then. He did not smile. He handed Patrick to Robert, rose slowly, and crossed the yard on foot. Each step deliberate, as though approaching something fragile. "I'm back," he said, voice rougher than before. "I see that," she replied. They stood a few paces apart. The children hovered, sensing the tension. David glanced toward the field. "You've done well." "We had to." He nodded once. Then, quietly, "I owe you truth." She folded her arms. "You owe me more than that." He accepted it without flinching. "I went," he said, "because the fee he named was more than we could gather before winter. Because if I stayed, we would be counting every sack of corn come frost. Because I've lived too long one season from hunger not to know the cost." She said nothing. "I didn't tell you," he continued, "because if you'd asked me to stay, I would have. And if I'd stayed, would have resented the fear that made me do it. And I did not want that to grow between us. The honesty hurt more than excuses would have. You chose for both of us," she said quietly. He answered. "And that was wrong. I see that now." Silence stretched. Wind moved through the dry corn. David took a breath that seemed to come from deep in his bones. But hear me now, he said. The whole road west, every campfire, every river crossing, I thought I knew what freedom felt like. I've lived half my life chasing it. And I found myself counting days to come back to a cabin with smoke that drifts sideways and children who argue over beans. Jean smiled faintly, not understanding but pleased to be included. David's gaze stayed on Ranchel. I thought land was what a man needed to root him, he went on. Turns out it's people. I didn't know that until I left you. Something in her chest shifted, but she did not let it show. He reached into his coat and drew out a small pouch. The weight of it was unmistakable. It's enough, he said. For the fee. For salt and flour besides. Winter won't break us this year. She looked at the pouch, then back at him. Coin does not mend what absence tears. No, he agreed. Only time and truth can. He stepped closer, stopping within reach but not touching her. My heart stayed here, he said simply. Whether my body was or not. I felt the lack of you like cold. Of them like hunger. Her throat tightened. I am done with leaving, he said. Not because I'm tired of roads. Because I've found where I belong. The children watched, wide-eyed, as though witnessing a ritual they did not understand. David drew a breath, then spoke with a steadiness that held no doubt. I love you, Ranchel. The words hung in the clear autumn air, plain, unadorned. I loved you before I left, he continued, but I did not know how to say it without sounding like a man claiming. I don't claim you. I choose you. Tears burned behind her eyes. She blinked hard. I don't ask because I need shelter, he said. I ask because I want a life built beside yours, not passing through it. He reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her time to withdraw. She did not. Marry me, he said, voice low. Not for land. Not for fear. But because we have already begun to live as if we meant to stay. The world seemed very still. Ranchel looked at him, sun-browned, worn, eyes steady not with promise but with decision. She thought of winter alone. Of spring laughter. Of nights where touch had been chosen, not endured. Of her children's shoulders easing when he entered a room. She had once crossed an ocean without wanting to. This step, though smaller, felt greater. Yes, she said. The word left her like breath long held. David closed his eyes briefly, relief and gratitude crossing his face without disguise. He drew her into his arms, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that felt like home. Behind them, the field stood ready for harvest. The air carried the scent of dry corn and turning leaves. Work still waited. Winter still lay ahead. But now, when it came, they would meet it together, not by accident of survival, but by choice. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.